And now we are recording. Excellent. So welcome to my students for joining us once again here in History 312, Medieval Civilization. Welcome to our Zoom inhabitants for the Program for Learning and Community Engagement. And just very brief note, our next place event is going to be on Thursday, the 24th of February, when we are welcoming Dr. Vaughn Booker from Dartmouth at 6 p.m. over Zoom. He will be talking on there we go, let somebody in. April has joined us, even though she's right in front of me. And he will be speaking on irreverent aspects of African-American religion. So that's our Black History Month lecture as well. So I'll send out some information about that. For the students in History 312, our next event is next Tuesday when we have class again, and we'll be talking about the later Crusades. But today we're talking about the First Crusade. So I like to begin with a very, let me go ahead and start the slideshow so you can see it. With a very basic question. What is a crusade? And I'm going to go ahead and use the chat as though it's a blackboard. So I will occasionally type things on it that you should imagine have meaning and value or not. It's up to you. So what's a crusade? What do you think of? Adam, yeah, you're right in front of me.
It's when someone goes on a mission, either with like further.
Okay, someone going, these days we do tend to mean in a very general sense, I'm going to go on a mission, but I'm going to be very fervent about it, right? I'm going to be very dedicated to what I'm doing. I'm on a crusade. So you hear politicians use it all the freaking time, right? We are constantly on crusades in this society against something. Crusade against hunger, crusade against poverty. And it's usually seen as kind of like a positive connotation. Like I'm a crusader against crime or something like that, which, yeah, that's an interesting kind of etymological aspect. Yes, Cal.
It's like when somebody goes out usually under like a religious context to suppress and oppress others on another religion and to put themselves on their own.
Excuse me. That's better. Right. Okay. So when we think about it in a political context, as the Caped Crusader, exactly. And as Emily points out in the chat, yeah, it's this sort of like religious kind of mission or a political mission, but there's some destination and point where we're going to make things better by going on the crusade.
Dr. Perry's, a mission to change the world.
A mission to change the world. Did I miss that, Michael? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Mission to change the world. Right. That's the perception of it that we've got. And to the medieval Christian audience, in some ways, that would have made a lot of sense. That's what they thought they were doing. Many of them did, right? So one of the readings that the students did today was selections from the Gesta Francorum. And the Gesta Francorum means, let me go ahead and stop sharing just so I can go over to it. The Gesta Francorum basically means the deeds of the Franks. And the Franks, let me just do this so we don't have to keep moving. The Franks are what they tended to call the French people who went on the crusade. We'll come back to this in just a minute, but they do clearly think that they're on a mission from God to basically go liberate the Holy Land, which had been in non-Christian hands for about 400 years by this point, but whatever, we'll get to that little detail in a few minutes. But they do very clearly think that what they're doing is a mission to improve the world. Absolutely. And we'll kind of talk about why they think that in just a minute. Okay, so I title this, not surprisingly and not particularly originally, Deus Vult, which my friends who do Latin will tell us means close, very close to for the glory of God. It's a little more intentional than that. Deus Vult, God, Deus Vult, orders it, wills it, desires it, wants it, right? So usually it is translated into modern English as God wills it. And so, will of God, too slow, not wrong. And so this is often put into the accounts of Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont. We'll see it in just a minute, that the inhabitants, after he finished speaking, rose to their feet in a clamor and chanted Deus Vult, Deus Vult. God wills it. If it weren't sacrilegious, I would suggest that perhaps you could end all of our classes with like Nakashian Volt. Just a suggestion if you wanted to do that. I'm not seeing any. Adam might do it. I appreciate that. The rest of you don't seem particularly persuaded. Okay. So another question about the Crusades is why do they happen when they do, right? Why do the Crusades happen here in the late 1000s? Because as I mentioned, the point of the Crusade, the stated purpose of it is to go out here where Jerusalem is and take it away from the Muslims who run it. When did the Muslims take Jerusalem?
400 years earlier.
Yeah, like I said, 400 years earlier, thereabouts, right? They get it in the 600s. 600s. They took Jerusalem. Why, where was the clamor before that? What has changed? So that's sort of one of the questions we have to ask as well. So let me just give you a little bit of the lay of the land. The world of 1100, this is not a perfect map, but no map is, but it's good enough for our purposes. Looks at a Europe that is very divided. Obviously, you can tell by all the different colors and such like, but is unified to some extent in religion, right? So the western part of Europe, from England, Scotland, the French regions, the German regions, the northern Spanish regions, the northern Italian regions, all of this area here is largely following the lead coming out of Rome, right? And we've already talked in this class about why there is such a thing as a pope and why there is such a thing as the Bishop of Rome kind of taking a leadership role in Western Christianity. And they don't run Europe. They barely run the Christian church in the West, but they do at least have this position of some authority. So that's what Western Europe is doing. Over here, this kind of pinkish area that our map just calls the Roman Empire, which I think is fair, is what a lot of times these days we call the Byzantine Empire, to differentiate it from the earlier Roman Empire. And it's based here in Constantinople. So this is in a lot of ways the largest and most powerful Christian country in the 11th century, but they don't listen to Rome. Very famously, they'd been moving away from Rome for a long time religiously. And in the 1050s, they officially decided, we're not listening to Rome anymore. We're going our own way. And this is eventually going to develop into what these days we call the Greek Orthodox Church. And it's going to have a different kind of liturgical and ideological basis. All right, so then out here, in what is the Middle East today, you have a series of Muslim countries, Muslim kingdoms, Muslim principalities. They're not particularly unified. As you can tell by this map, there's really not a lot of solidity. You've got the Abbasid Caliphate out here in modern day Iraq and into Iran. You've got the Fatimids down here in Egypt. They don't really get along with anyone else here. You've got a bunch of Muslim princes who are in what is modern day like Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Eastern Turkey. And so it's a pretty fractious area. Most interactions between the Muslims, Byzantines, and Western Christians would be for things like trade. So they would tend to be fairly peaceful, more or less. There's a fair amount of trade, certainly between the Byzantines and the Muslims, and over here in Spain between the Spanish princes and principalities and the Muslim leaders down here, though that is starting to change as the Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Leon especially are launching what later on we call the Reconquista, which is an impressive name for retaking land that they themselves never controlled in the first place, but never let that get in the way. So they're going to start launching more campaigns against these Muslim princes down here and taking this land for primarily those two kingdoms in Spain. Okay. For all of these people, oh, hi, Tricia. For all of these people, this city of Jerusalem is really important, right? The city of Jerusalem is fundamental in its importance to the three major Abrahamic religions that come out of the Middle East: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's not the most important city in Islamic tradition. That would be Mecca and Medina, maybe close behind it. But Jerusalem is really important to the Muslims for various reasons. A, because it is the center of sort of Judaic and Christian worship, and Islam sees those as earlier incomplete incarnations of God's message, I suppose, or God's what do you call it, revelation to the world. But it's also where Muhammad has some pretty important spiritual experiences, we'll put it that way. Obviously, for Christians, it's a pretty important area for Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And for the Jewish community, it was really important as the temple and Solomon and the center of the kingdom of Judah. So it's a city that was kind of really, really fundamental to all of these various religions. So control of the city was something that was always really, really important to all of these various people. Now, I mentioned, or actually Adam mentioned earlier, that Jerusalem's been held by the Muslims since the 600s. So why does this not kick off a crusade then or soon after? Adam.
The European states were a lot less centralized and had a lot less.
Okay. Yeah, so let's see. So let's say why in the late 11th century? One, Western states were less able, sure, okay, to launch a crusade. Okay, fair enough. What else? Adam again, yeah. Amen. Jump in there, baby, whatever.
The pilgrims and visitors have been allowed to travel until that point, visit peacefully through the area.
Yeah, we'll say changes on the ground. Now, one of the things that is going to be claimed by Western Christians. Demographic pressures. Okay, yeah, we'll talk about that in just a second, actually. That's a good point. One of the stated reasons is that the Muslims who held this area had for a long time been, like I said, very fractious, right? There was a lot of fighting between them. You know, you've got dozens of various Islamic princes who are holding land in this entire area, and they don't like each other any more than the Western Christians like each other, right? They're all unified by one religion, and they're unified by a general dislike of each other. So they're going to fight each other all the time. And just like how, you know, French princes are fighting each other all the time, and German princes are fighting each other all the time, same with the Muslims. And what that allowed the Byzantines to do, as the largest Christian power right here, was it allowed the Byzantines to basically dominate the region to the extent that the lanes to Jerusalem were fairly safe, right? That, you know, the Byzantines are the biggest power on the block. And if you are a series of small Muslim princes, you don't really want to get the Byzantines involved in your affairs if you can avoid it. So you're going to largely stay out of those concerns. And if the Byzantines are saying, look, you can't hinder pilgrims going to Jerusalem, you're going to do your part. You're also not particularly against Christian pilgrims going to Jerusalem if you're like the Muslim princes of Antioch. Why not?
There's a church there they'll stop off at, and they'll usually kind of help out the economy a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be part of it, right? Like, pilgrims bring money, they're tourists. And, they're passing through, who cares? They're leaving, and they'll leave a few ducats on the table while they do. Everybody wins. And so for a long time, that's kind of how it worked, right? That this was if you wanted to make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, you essentially could. Well, one of the things that's changing, and this is just one of the things that's changing, is that there is a new Muslim power that is becoming ascendant in the region. Here, the map calls it the Roman Sultanate. That's not really a great translation for it.
The Ottoman Empire.
Not quite it's the Sultanate of Run, which is the Turkish word for Roman. So that's, I guess, why they translate it that way. But it's essentially this group known as the Seljuks. And the Seljuks are Turks. There's going to be a series of Turkish groups that kind of rise up and carve out areas in this region. The last of whom is going to be the Ottomans. They're going to build an empire that'll last 500 or 600 years. But the Seljuks are the first ones who kind of emerge in this area, and they start kind of dominating all the other Muslim princes in the region and building them into a more unified, coherent whole. Well, the Byzantines get pretty concerned about this, not surprisingly, because they do not want to see a unified, powerful Seljuk state on their eastern border. So they decide to go do something about it, right? They're going to go take care of this. And so the Byzantine army, which is the imperial army of the Eastern Romans, They get together and they march out, and in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, they fight the Seljuk Turks. And it is perhaps, to borrow a phrase from World War I, the news from the front was not entirely good. Let's put it that way. The Byzantine army gets obliterated. The Seljuk Turks just mop the floor with them and destroy the main offensive capacity of the Byzantine Empire. And once they do that, they start taking land from the Byzantines out here as well and kind of carving it up themselves and sort of advancing. So in fact, this map shows after the Byzantines recover a little bit. But if we looked at this map in the 1070s, the Seljuks pretty much get all the way up to about here, which is the city of Nicaea, which is a major city in the Byzantine Empire and in Christianity, right? The Council of Nicaea kind of establishes what Christianity is going to look like back in the 4th century. And they're not that far from Constantinople. So this was bad. This was bad for the Byzantines, that they had gone out to try to arrest the rise of the Seljuks, and they had made things much worse. That now they're in a position where it's not that they're holding back the Seljuk rise. They're kind of worried that they're going to lose their empire to the Seljuk Turks. And that doesn't happen because Constantinople is a really, really well-defended city. But what does happen is if the Seljuks can't take, Constantinople and the rest of the Byzantine Empire, what can they take?
Jerusalem.
They can take Jerusalem. And they can take all these little states along the Levantine coast, which are incredibly wealthy, these old Phoenician states, Phoenician cities going all the way back to the ancient world, places like Tyre and Antioch and Sidon and all the rest, and Acre and so forth. These are all really, really wealthy places that had held their independence because no one wanted the Byzantines to come in and prevent one side from getting too powerful. Well, now the Byzantines don't have an army anymore. And the Seljuks sweep down the coast. And by 1075, they take Jerusalem. In 1085, they take Antioch, which is actually the biggest city in the region. And so here by the 1080s, now we're in a very different world. By the early 1090s, the Seljuks expel most of the Greek Orthodox leadership from this area of what is modern day Turkey. And they are kind of depriving Christian pilgrims from having a safe path to get from Constantinople down to Jerusalem. So by the early 1090s, the situation has changed pretty precipitously. So it's not that the Crusades are launched against the backdrop of the Muslims holding Jerusalem. They had held Jerusalem for centuries. It's against the backdrop, at least the stated backdrop, of this rise of a unified Muslim power that no longer had a Byzantine counterweight to it, right? That you no longer could rely on the Byzantines to kind of go in and keep the peace and make everything okay. All right, so that's one part of it. The other part of it is ideological. So before we get to the Council of Clermont, there had been some changes ideologically in the Christian church, in the West, that is. And what those were the kind of growing importance or, how can I put it? Relevance, I guess, of penitential activities. What are penitential activities? Adam.
Kind of, instead of just like saying that you repent, kind of like showing repentance in a way.
Okay, repentance, right, in a religious context means you are sorry for whatever negative thing you've done, right? Well, that's nice, but God is the great judge. So, and I've heard this. I don't know that it's true, but I'm pretty confident that if you go into a court after having committed a crime, it's not enough just to be like, sorry, right? Yeah, I didn't. You could use the old Steve Martin bit. I forgot that was a crime. But, I'm sorry is not much better, is it? I mean, I guess it's nice. Maybe the punishment will be less, but there is always punishment. When you commit a crime, there is punishment. So one of the early things that the Christian church talks about, and it's not just the Christians, every religious tradition basically has this mechanism, is if you do something that is a crime against God, which is what a sin is, then how do you make up for it? And hi, Hinton. You know, if this were a course on Christian history, which someday maybe I'll teach, we could talk about it in great detail, how this developed, this idea of when you die, you want to not go to hell, but you cannot die with sin on your soul. So how do you get rid of it?
Forgiveness, you get baptized.
Sure, yeah, in today's world, it's easy. No offense to modern Christians. You get baptized and you ask for forgiveness. That's nice. And that was true then too. You had to have that. You had to have repentance. But what was different was that there was a much stronger belief that you needed to, frankly, pay for your crimes. It wasn't enough just to say you were sorry. You had to actually do the time as well, right?
Some of them would cut off arms or feet or what.
Well, you could I mean, yes, if you were going very literally, I suppose, from the New Testament, pluck out the eye that offends or something. Yeah, you can do all sorts of interesting things to try to atone. Calla.
Are you speaking like a general religious sense when it comes to like sins?
It depends. Mostly in the Abrahamic tradition, there was this idea that violating the sacred, whatever it was, there was going to be some kind of punishment. And that punishment was going to be both temporal and spiritual.
So I know for me, in my it's like the gods are hard to anger, but when you do, you offer.
Right. You have to make amends. And so there's always this idea that you had to make amends for what you did. So very, very, very briefly, Christianity developed a series of penitential structures in the early Middle Ages, late Roman period, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, of how you could do this, how you could make up for the sin you created or the sin you committed. And this could be, okay, baptism, that's great. But what happens if you sin after you get baptized?
You got sin on you.
Yeah, you got sin on you, you're basically toast. So a lot of people in the early days would delay baptism until their deathbed, which was a dangerous gambit and is not what the church wants you to do. So they developed things like confession, right? Confession to a priest, because of that part of the scriptures where Christ says to Peter, what you bind on earth, I'll bind in heaven. What you loose on earth, I'll loose in heaven. Developed this idea that the priesthood was an intercessory force for you with God. So they developed the idea of confession. And then there was a whole question of, well, how many times can you confess? Does it have, originally you could do it once and it had to be public, and that was it. It was like a one-shot deal. And then they realized, okay, well, that's, again, same problem as baptism. People are just going to do it right before they die, and so on and so forth. They're kind of negotiating ideologically to try to figure out, how do we create a system that both gives you a shot to get into heaven, but is also just. And what do they mean by just? Because this is something that, Christians and others had to wrestle with a great deal. Why are they building these kind of systems? Yeah.
They don't want people to take advantage of it and just kind of live like a horrible life, and then right at the end just be like, okay, now I'm good.
Kind of like your consequences.
Right. That, there's this cosmic notion of fairness that they're trying to capture, right? They do not want to believe that this horrible puppy abusing nun toaster like Raoul de Cambrai has just as good a shot of getting into heaven as this nice, lovely person who spent all of their time helping widows and orphans and so forth. They're like, no, that blatantly God is rationality itself. Therefore, bad people go to hell, good people go to heaven. Well, now we need a system that tells us who the good people are and who the bad people are. And so the whole penitential apparatus is kind of built. That's a very short and, maybe not the best description of how we get here, but it works. So by the time we get to the 11th century, there had been some sort of movements around this idea of what actions counted as penitential activities. One of them was pilgrimage. And what's a pilgrimage? Sorry, I'm trying to move my little people over here on the sides, they're not blocking. What's a pilgrimage?
It's a path that you take.
Okay, it's whatever real path that you take, right? Like it's a trip that you take somewhere. And specifically for them, it was a pilgrimage, like it was a trip you took to a holy site. So we go back to, journey to a holy destiny. Thank you, Emily. So when you go back to our map, if you are like from France, you're out in Paris over here, and you've done something really bad, and you want to make amends to God, maybe your penitence, your penitential activity is to walk to Jerusalem, which is about 2,800 miles, barefoot.
You'll die.
You may die, but if you die in the grace of God. And so going on pilgrimage was seen as sort of like the ultimate thing you could do to show your dedication. Now, you don't have to go all the way to Jerusalem. You could take a pilgrimage to Rome. You could take a pilgrimage down to St. James de Compostela in Spain. That was a big area.
Was anyone ever recorded going from Paris to Jerusalem?
Oh, all the time. Yeah. Oh, no, this is not an uncommon thing. People are doing this a lot. You can go to the location of a saint. Any cathedral worth its salt is going to have some saints' relics in it. So worst case scenario, you can take a pilgrimage down to the cathedral. So after Thomas Becket gets murdered in England in the 1170s, you could go to Canterbury. Yeah. So if you ever read Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, that's what they're doing. They're going on pilgrimage to Canterbury to go pray at the altar of Thomas Becket. And so pilgrimage was seen as this kind of meaningful penitential thing you could do. All right, that's part of it. Other part of it, okay, is they had been playing around with the idea of holy war, in that we've got evidence of Christian bishops talking about you would get spiritual rewards if you fought in a cause that was for the church or for God, okay? We have bishops of Rome, right? Early popes as far back as the 800s and 900s talking about if you go fight the Muslims down in Sicily, or if you fight the Vikings or something. And we saw that even in the Battle of Malden, right? That they clearly thought that they were fighting on behalf of God against these Vikings who were non-Christian. That there was some spiritual benefit to it. They weren't entirely sure what it was. They weren't quite sure how it worked. But by God, this cosmic justice tells us that if I fight for the church, God's going to be happy. And that can't hurt, right? When I'm standing in front of St. Peter to be like, well, I did go fight the Vikings, or I did go fight the Muslims outside of Syracuse, or whatever it is, right? So all of this comes together in the late 1000s. This is what leads us to the Crusaders. So you've got this geopolitical change down here in the Middle East in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's a geopolitical change that is a problem for Western Europe. Why? I mean, let's be fair. Why do the French care what is happening over here on the Levant? Calla.
It's going to block out important trade routes.
Okay.
They're going to be threatened when they're trying to trade with the Silk Road. They're going to be, obviously threatened because they're going to be morale hits into a holy site being lost.
Okay. Yeah, I'd say that functionally, trade is going to be a problem. These folks, this is a very interconnected world that we're building here in the Middle Ages. Trade routes are springing up all throughout Europe and knitting it together, which was great until you got things like the plague, and it was less great, but whatever. That's not until the 14th century. And so, yeah, there's going to be a problem, but there's no evidence that they launched this expedition because of that, right? Like that'd be a whole different papal address. We need to get together because my silk is under threat. But it's definitely not, that's like the silk prices are rising, inflationary pressures, supply chain issues, see, contemporary problems. So that is certainly true, that there is an economic side to this. Religious morale is a problem because ownership of Jerusalem always sort of kind of meant God was on your side to some extent. Like the Christians for hundreds of years had been wrestling with the, hey, if we're the chosen people, how come the Muslims hold Jerusalem? Like even in the best of times, occasionally theologians, maybe when they got a little too far in the cup, would be like, hey, and another thing, why is it? And then luckily for them, they had the Old Testament, which is mostly about how the Israelites are the chosen people and terrible things happen to them all the time. So yeah, they already had some mechanisms that they could use to understand why this was the case. But from a functional standpoint, if you are going to go on pilgrimage, this is now a problem. And pilgrimage was a major mechanism for gaining penitential sort of absolution in the eyes of God. So if you can't get to Jerusalem anymore, that is a problem. So you have all of this sort of coming together at about the same idea. You've got the papacy promulgating this notion of penitential warfare, right, which is what holy war is. This notion that fighting can be good for your soul. That's somewhat of a new idea. And in a lot of ways, that's why I wanted to give this talk on behalf of Place, because I think that modern Christians especially have a very specific set of beliefs about Christianity's relationship to violence. Generally speaking, when we talk about Christianity today, we do not tend to see it as an inspirer toward religious violence. Not generally. Well, besides, yes, Cal, I have a different perspective, that's fair. But generally speaking, we don't see that many wars in our minds fought to promote, Christian dominance over other people. I think when you think about the figure of Christ, what do most people focus on?
The crucifixion.
Okay, fair, touche. They think about the crucifixion, right? But I mean, that itself is kind of an interesting idea, right? If he's the Son of God, he could have wiped out all the Romans around him, but he doesn't because he suffers, right? He suffers on behalf of humanity. So there's a suffering aspect to it. Adam. Sacrifice, right? He sacrifices himself for humanity. When you talk about his teachings, most people talk about things like, turning the other cheek and embracing your enemies and all that kind of stuff. So, it's a much, what's that? Loving your neighbor, yeah. It's very kind of pacifistic-y, this idea that Christianity is uneasy with violence. And that is true in the Middle Ages, meaning that there are a lot of folks who believe that Christianity is antithetical to violence. But those ideas pretty much have to be mitigated against the reality that your realms are Christian. So again, if we go all the way back to the Romans, when Christianity was just a illegal sect beneath Roman society, you can have as many pacifistic ideas as you want, unless you get drafted like St. Martin, in which case then you have to address them. But once it becomes an imperial religion at the end of the 4th century, I'm just putting it out there that if you're the Roman Empire and you officially become pacifistic in 395, yeah, no more Roman Empire pretty quickly. I mean, the Persians are thrilled. Yeah, amen. You should be pacifists. So very, very quickly, over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity has to figure out, okay, when is violence okay? And you get a whole discourse on just war, and Augustine plays with this, and it's a whole thing. And so by the time we're here in the 11th century, we're kind of taking that idea that there are times when war is okay, and we're pushing it to the next step, which is sometimes war is good. Like sometimes it's actually good for you, because a lot of the people who are fighting in the 11th century are doing so believing that it is imperiling their souls, that when you shed blood, you are committing some kind of sin against God. In fact, in the late 1060s, it was right before this, when William, Duke of Normandy's army wins the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the papal legate, I know, I'm sorry, April, it killed your family, I apologize. The papal legate, when he shows up, he orders all of them to do penance for having shed blood of Christians and for having taken part in violence. So there was still this clear idea that, violence was bad, but they're going to figure out a way to make it so that violence is not just okay, it might actually be good. It might be okay. And that's going to be one of the other shifts that we have to see when we get to the Crusaders. Okay, so let's see how they do it. Let's stop that and let's go to this. Actually, I'll stick with this and then I don't want it to be full screen though. You'd think after 2 years I'd figure out what the heck I was doing, but whatever. Okay, let's go to that one, that's fine. Okay, so when we look at Urban's speech at Clermont, Urban is the Bishop of Rome, so he's the Pope. And in 1095, he gives this speech to the assembled group. This council, as I think I mentioned earlier in the semester for my students at least, this council actually is part of what is called the Peace of God movement. And the Peace of God movement was, and that is peace as in peace, not war, was basically an effort by the church in the 10th and 11th centuries, primarily in France, to take an active role in minimizing social violence. So again, last week and earlier this week, we talked about like governance and such like, and at the time in France, the King of France is struggling to get his nobles to listen to him and to stop killing each other. You all remember reading The Deeds of Louis the Fat, one of my favorite readings. And this is sort of part of that, the Pope and other bishops in France are coming together routinely saying, you all need to stop fighting each other, right? You need to stop fighting your neighbors. You need to, they even put in like what days you can fight. You're not supposed to fight on like Fridays or Saturdays or Sundays. Because they're holy, and so they're trying to narrow it down. You're not supposed to fight the unarmed, mostly clerics. Stop killing us in your stupid wars, and so forth. So they're trying to put in rules of combat and rules of violence, and this is part of that. This council that then leads to the Crusades. So anyway, this version of it is from what's called the Gesta Francorum, and the Gesta Francorum is the earliest of the accounts we have of the First Crusade. It's written probably right around the time the First Crusade is concluded in 1100, and it's written from the perspective of one of the major combatants, a fellow by the name of Bohemond. So that's why this is kind of shorter. If you look at other versions of the Council of Clermont, you will have much longer versions of them by guys like Baldric of Dol and Fulcher of Chartres and so forth, but this is kind of the earliest one. And the earliest one is basically I like to think kind of the core, which is Urban basically says, essentially the chronicler tells you that Urban says this. If any man would come after me, quoting the Gospels, right? Let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. A mighty agitation was carried on all throughout the region of Gaul. That's what I love about these authors. They all still think they're writing like Cicero. Gaul is France, in case you're wondering. Its tenor was that if anyone desired to follow the Lord zealously with a pure heart and mind and wished faithfully to bear the cross after him, he would no longer hesitate to take up the way to the Holy Sepulchre, right? The Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And so Urban, Pope of the Roman See, with his archbishops and bishops and abbots and priests, set out as quickly as possible beyond the mountains and began to deliver sermons and to preach eloquently, saying, whoever wishes to save his soul shall not hesitate humbly to take up the way of the Lord. And if he lacks sufficient money, divine mercy will give him enough. And then he continued, brethren, we ought to endure much suffering for the name of Christ, misery, poverty, nakedness, persecution, want, illness, hunger, thirst, and other ills of this kind, just as the Lord saith to his disciples, ye suffer much in my name, and be not ashamed to confess me before the faces of men, etc., etc. And when this speech had already begun to be noised abroad little by little throughout the regions and countries of Gaul, the Franks, that's the French, upon hearing such reports, forthwith caused crosses to be sewed upon their right shoulders, saying that they followed with one accord the footsteps of Christ, by which they had been redeemed from the hand of hell. This is the briefest version of his speech. But I think it gives us a lot that should now, after 40 minutes of me haranguing you, look pretty familiar. So what are the most important parts you see just in that first section? Cal.
If you don't have enough money.
Okay, yeah. Money should not prevent you from going. Okay, that's one. Good. What else? Okay, yeah, this is something we've talked about already, but it's something that our audience would maybe not have thought too much about. That in Christianity, at this time and before it, and frankly, for a long time afterwards, and maybe even still today, there was this idea that suffering for Christ was not only necessary, it was good, right? It was good for you because it showed your dedication. It showed your devotion. And a lot of this is taken from this notion when Christ says that you will suffer for following me, right? You'll notice the first thing he says that he quotes, let him deny himself and take his cross and follow me. A lot of Christians in the Middle Ages were pretty clear that that was a necessity. And for the Crusaders, that made a lot of sense, right? That yes, we're going to go suffer for Christ. So a very, very common refrain you would hear from medieval knights specifically was Christ died for us. It's our turn to die for him, right? Or Christ suffered for us. So we suffer for him. To take up our cross and follow him meant we suffer for him. This is, you'll see this for hundreds of years across every country in medieval Europe. This was a basic sort of mechanism of understanding why your life following Christ was not going to be, you know, Skittles and rainbows, that you were going to be called upon to suffer. And you can see versions of this all over medieval documents. One of my favorites, this is apropos of nothing, comes from an English knight in, I think in the early 14th century, so hundreds of years after this, who's up in Scotland. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Scotland or not. It's a beautiful country, except when you're there. And it's raining and it's cold and you're sitting in a field and getting shot at by Scottish people. And he writes this whole letter basically saying, who suffers more than we do? And he's fighting up there for the king. He's not even on crusade. But he talks about like his armor rusting onto him and the bridles, falling apart and his friends dying of dysentery. And he's like, surely we suffer more for Christ than any cleric. I love that. Your happy fat monks down writing books. Clearly they don't suffer enough for Christ. But anyway, so this is a very broad idea in medieval Christianity, especially among the warriors, the warrior class. This idea of they suffer specifically. Now, the idea of meritorious suffering was general, right? This is not just warriors. Everybody kind of has this notion that you're going to suffer. And a lot of it's based on the Old Testament, the New Testament, right? Christ is speaking to an audience of oppressed poor people mostly. So this idea that, yes, your suffering is good kind of makes sense. But you're also living in a society that's not particularly fair. So a lot of people are suffering and poor and so forth. Anyway, all right. So this is a pretty broad idea of how you access God, that suffering on this world is good for you in the next one. Like there aren't that many examples of Christ being like, so are you really rich and powerful now? I'll make you richer and more powerful in heaven. It's pretty much the opposite, isn't it? Like if the last will be first and, poor rich people aren't going to go to heaven, that kind of stuff. So suffering on this world is good for you. Good. Anything else from that bit?
That this is how you save yourself.
Okay, yeah. That this is going to lead you to salvation. And that is the point, right? That's why religion exists, is to not go to hell. I mean, it has other points, I know that, but like at the end of the day, that's really important. Now, in this version of it, it's pretty general, right? That they had been redeemed from the hand of hell by following in the footsteps of Christ. In other versions of it, he's a little more specific about what he's actually saying, because a lot of crusaders then go on crusade and believe that because they're on crusade, they're going to heaven. And the church has to kind of walk that back a little bit later on, like, well, no, we didn't say that. What they're going to claim is that going on crusade meant you didn't have to do other penance on earth for your sins. So this gets into kind of a legal versus cultural thing. The Crusaders think, I'm on crusade, I'm going to heaven. And the church is like, well, it's sort of like the fine print. They're like, wait, we didn't promise that in the deal. You only get the introductory rate for, 6 months. Sorry. But this means you don't have to do other temporal penance for your sins, because they look at this as an armed pilgrimage. Now, that is what it develops into much later on. So for those of you who are going to be here on Tuesday, i.e. my students, when we look at the later Crusades, that's kind of the conception that they eventually develop, that this is basically a pilgrimage that you're taking your sword with. You're taking your sword with you, and if you end up putting it through a Muslim person's head, ideally one who you're fighting, not an innocent, then that's good. Then you're doing God's work too.
Ideally, you're still committing a sin.
But you're not. That's the point, is that you're not committing a sin anymore because it is just war. Because in Christian societies, in order to have a war be considered just, like if you're looking at Augustine, it had to be led by a legitimate authority. It had to be proportional to what the violence being directed towards it was. And it basically had to be primarily ideally defensive. And that's what they think this is. Now, it's a stretch. I'm not going to lie. Not that I'm taking sides in this conflict of just war or anything, but it'd be a tough argument in front of the international court that somehow the Seljuks taking Jerusalem is a direct attack on France, but whatever. They're looking at it kind of broadly, and they're saying this is an attack on our religion, so we must go defend it. Adam, then we'll move on to the actual narrative. I
thought it was interesting in the document how it said it primarily happened in France.
Yeah.
Didn't happen in the Holy Roman Empire, didn't happen in England or anything like that. It started out as something that happened kind of in France.
Right, and that's a good point, that the First Crusade, which is the topic that we're looking at today, it's not exclusively French, but it is mostly French. So when you look at who the Crusaders are, they're primarily coming from northern France, sort of like central and northern France, which is where Clermont is. The Duke of Normandy is going to go. He's the brother of the English king. But there aren't that many English crusaders on the First Crusade, mostly because the King of England at the time, William II, is currently feuding with the Pope, and he doesn't really like the church much anyway. So he does not. In fact, I think he bars people from going. I'm not sure, but he definitely doesn't encourage them. There'll be some from Germany, but not a huge number. These peace council, because this was a peace council, right? That was a mostly French thing. So there's going to be a lot of French who go. There's going to be a decent number of Normans living down in Italy who are going to go. And there'll be some from Germany and other places. And there are some from England, but not that many. But yeah, frankly, most of them are French. So the First Crusade is primarily a French expedition. The later Crusades are going to be much broader than that. So, the Second Crusade will be French and German. The Third Crusade will be French, German, and English. And then the later Crusades will actually be a lot of Hungarian, Poles, and that sort of group. But in this first one, yeah, it's mostly the Franks. Okay, so as the reading, the Gesta Francorum points out, Urban preaches this, and the first response comes from who? It's not even it is the French, but it's very specific.
I'm going to throw it out there, Queens.
No, it wasn't a queen. No. It's okay. I'll show you. It's all right.
I don't like that.
No, pressure of speech got to you. It's the Popular Crusade. So the very first response came from common people. And these folks, there are some that we would call nobles who go on this crusade, but a lot of these folks are just kind of regular people. So a lot of, non-nobles, some townsmen, some nobles, lesser nobles, they are fired with religious, righteous enthusiasm, and they assemble to go on crusade. And it does not go very well. They make their way in a meandering kind of mess to Constantinople, where the emperor Alexius Comnenus, who had asked for Western aid to fight the Muslims, is deeply annoyed and unhappy about this. So one of the other things that was leading up to the Council of Clermont was that Alexius Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, had written a letter to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and it basically said, could you arrange for several thousand Western, basically mercenaries, to join my army that he's still trying to rebuild 20 years later from Manzikert, and we'll go fight the Muslims and we'll take Jerusalem back. They're probably not going to take Jerusalem back, but he's at least going to get back a lot of his land that was lost to the Seljuk Turks. So that's what he's expecting, was that the Pope is out somehow organizing, 3,000 to 4,000 decently competent, well-trained soldiers who are going to come fight for him under his flag. And what he gets is pretty much the worst stereotype of Western Christians that the Greeks already have. Frankly, in medieval society, the Byzantine Empire is the urban, erudite, educated, classy kind of group. And Western Europe is basically the kind of agrarian local yokels. So in modern American terms, just imagine essentially it's the Beverly Hillbillies. All right, so imagine if the Beverly Hillbillies showed up armed to the teeth in Beverly Hills and are like, hey, we're here to help. That's fancy, I'll take that. And the emperor's like, what the hell? What is this madness? And so he just sends them across. He's like, yep, enemies over there. Go fight the Turks. And they do, and they get slaughtered, of course, because they're not a particularly effective military. So it all goes really, really badly, as you can imagine. But while that's happening, the main Crusader armies are being assembled. And so the main Crusader armies are the ones that are being assembled by really kind of the major nobility of Europe at the time. And I wish I could get this stupid thing to work the way I want it, but it's not doing too well for me. So I'll try to use this one. There we go. I'll just do that and leave it up like that. So the folks who are organizing the First Crusade are sort of the major nobility right below the kings. There's no kings that go on the First Crusade. It's going to be primarily dukes and counts. So these are major figures, but they're not the rulers. Part of that is because this is kind of a new idea, but also part of it is, as my History 312 students might remember, we are still in the throes of what we call the investiture controversy, right? And so the rulers of like France and England and Germany aren't really all that friendly with the Pope, as they're currently feuding over who got to enfranchise bishops with their authority. So when the Pope says, hey, I need you to put together an army that you're going to pay for and march 3,000 miles to fight an enemy you have no knowledge about. Yeah, weirdly enough, many of the kings are like, I don't think that's a good plan. But the dukes and the counts, some of them do think it's a good plan. So you get Duke Robert of Normandy, you get Count Raymond of Toulouse, you get, I guess he's eventually Duke Bohemond, but that's a title that he kind of takes for himself later on, and a few others who all kind of assemble together, and they set out and head towards the Holy Land. By 1097, the Crusaders have reached Constantinople. So that's a full 2 years it takes for them to assemble these armies and get them to Constantinople after Pope Urban's call. This is not a unified army. That's one of the things we have to realize, right? These folks who are assembled, even the ones who are all from the same, what we would call country, again, my students know how problematic that term is for the Middle Ages, they don't like each other very much. They're not really used, I mean, I guess they're used to fighting each other, just not, they're used to fighting with each other, against each other rather than alongside each other. Adam, yeah.
because the kings weren't exactly on board and there for it, they don't have anyone they're really kind of keeping in check.
Right. So they don't have like any kind of organized leadership. They're basically doing this by council, right? So the major nobles will all kind of like get together and try to plan their next move. There is a representative of the papacy there. He's the Bishop of Le Puy. His name is Adhemar. And he sort of serves a little bit as kind of a unifying figure because he's like the Pope's representative, and this is a holy war. And so they get to Constantinople, and none of them really trust the Byzantines. The Byzantines do not trust them. The Byzantines had already seen the People's Crusade or the Popular Crusade show up and are like, we have low hopes, friends, of what you're going to be able to achieve. And when they get there, Alexius, the Byzantine emperor, tries to adhere to the deal that he thought he made with the Bishop of Rome. And he said, okay, well, thank you for coming. I will help you, right? We will give you supplies. We will use our navy to protect your flank as you march, but you're going to adhere to the deal that I made, which is when you liberate territory that had once belonged to the Byzantine Empire, who gets it? The Byzantine Empire gets it. This is my land. Now, I mean, frankly, if you are the if you're the Western Crusaders, that means pretty much all of this was once Byzantine, right? And in some ways, they're not all opposed to that. Why not?
Because they were there not to make kingdoms, but to go on the armed field.
Right, because a lot of them have no particular intention of staying in the Holy Land. This gets to Dr. Perry's point that I hadn't forgotten, Michael, I remember it, about the demographic issues of the First Crusade. There doesn't seem to, and this is sort of such a difficult question, how many of them intended to stay in the Holy Land? Some of them did. For some of them, I think there was an idea that this was a one-way trip, and that either they were going to die on crusade or they were going to liberate Jerusalem and then stay there. But for most of them, they don't have any intention of staying. That their lives and their livelihoods and their cultural milieu is back in France or wherever else, and they plan on returning someday. So for some of them, when Alexius makes this, demand, basically, fine, okay, sure, I have no intention of staying. Others, they're not so happy about it. So like Bohemond, who's a Norman who lives down in Italy, he's not particularly happy about it. And in fact, I wish I could have found it. I want to say he legitimately says that he swore the oath with his hands, like with his fingers crossed behind him, like something, it's honestly something like that. But yeah, I swore the oath, but I didn't mean it. It's fine. So they all sort of swear that, okay, fine, we'll do that. And the first test for them comes right here, which is at the city of Nicaea. So Alexius, sends them across the Bosporus, sends them onto the Asian part of the Byzantine Empire, and essentially says, okay, well, the Turks have taken the city of Nicaea. We need to get it back. And so the Crusaders do that. They besiege the city. The Muslims send a relief army to defeat them, which is unsuccessful. So usually in a medieval war, if you besieged an enemy's city or castle or something like that, once the people who held the castle realized that there was no chance of relief, they would usually surrender. And you'd figure out some kind of terms that did not involve murdering all of them or something like that. And so usually that meant like if their allies sent an army to relieve them and it failed, yeah, okay, now we'll probably surrender. And the city of Nicaea does surrender. But there's a bit of a twist. The Crusaders are besieging the city, and the Nicaeans do not want to surrender to them. Because if you surrender to the Crusaders, they are going to probably pillage your city for 3 to 4 days, something civilized like that. That was usually what happened when a city that had resisted a siege finally surrendered. There was a bit of pillage. So who do they surrender to? They surrender to the Byzantines. Quite clever. Because the Byzantines don't want to see this city get pillaged either, because it's their city. So they slip an envoy in, and the Crusaders wake up one day, and the gates are open, and the Byzantine flag is flying over the city, and they're like, what the hell happened? What is this? And the Byzantines are like, hey, we got it back, thanks a lot. And the Crusaders are kind of stuck. They're like, well, bully for us, I guess, but where's my pillage? I'm paying for this stupid expedition. I expected to be able to at least steal some things from some of your, some of your sites. This is unfair. So what that does is it sort of breaks this already tenuous alliance between the Western Christians and the Byzantines. The Western Christians feel that the Byzantines betrayed them, and the Byzantines feel that the Western Christians had no intention of keeping their oath. So two sides that didn't trust each other already, they basically go their separate ways. And so the Crusaders are going to march out to the Holy Land, but they're no longer going to do it with the eye toward giving any land back to the Byzantines. So they feel that that deal is off. And now if we take some land, we're going to figure out something to do with it ourselves. So they march their way across, and they get to this city here, Antioch. Antioch is one of the biggest cities of the Levant. If you can take it, then you've pretty much got an easy path down to Jerusalem. This is like the major Muslim stronghold in the Holy Land. But as they're doing this, as they're marching across what is modern day Turkey, the divisions within the Crusader army are growing because some of them feel they need to still adhere to the Byzantines. Guys like Count Raymond of Toulouse, he thinks, look, we made a deal. Others like Bohemond and his nephew Tancred are like, they broke the deal. We're free of that crap. We want our own stuff. And so already we're getting divisions in the Crusader army. In fact, before they get to Antioch, one of the Crusaders, Tancred, which is Bohemond's nephew, he just goes off to Edessa, which is like up here, right? He goes over here, and he just fights his own war. He's a fascinating guy. Or no, sorry, I got confused. He goes to Tarsus. Tancred goes down to Tarsus and starts getting involved with liberating that area. Yeah, liberating it is a fascinating way of referring to a place he's never been. The guy who goes off to Edessa is actually Baldwin of Flanders. He decides, you know what? I'm heading off on my own. And so he goes over here and he ends up fighting the Muslim princes up there and taking the city. The rest of the army gets to Antioch, which is one of the largest cities in the Holy Land. It's got absurdly, like 30-foot high walls and hundreds of towers. I mean, it's a big place. And so they besiege it. And the siege lasts for about a year. Yes, sir.
It also had a pretty important religious significance to them as well, to the Crusaders. That was the Church of Antioch was one of the bigger churches.
Oh yeah, it's one of the earlier churches. So this is an important religious site as in its own right. Yes, absolutely. They besiege it for about a year. It's a long freaking time. A lot of their army dies of dysentery and all these other problematic things. And then eventually, a person in the city betrays one of the towers to Bohemond specifically. Remember, there's no unified organization of this army. So he basically makes a deal with one of the tower guards, which gets Bohemond into the city. And once Bohemond is in the city, the Crusaders are able to enter and they run amok in the city. They storm Antioch. The Muslims retreat to the citadel, which is in the center of the city, up on another hill about 1,000 feet up. So you've got this small Muslim garrison in the center of the city. You've got the Crusaders in the rest of the city, burning and pillaging, committing all the oldest sins in the newest ways and having a grand old time. And then while they're doing that, they get word that a large Muslim army is approaching them from the outside, which is less good because the Turks had put together a relief army to go break the siege of Antioch. So now you've got the Crusaders besieging the Muslims in the citadel in the center of the city. And then you've got the Muslims outside besieging the entire city, besieging the besiegers. Make sense? Little concentric little circles of violence that are in this city. So long story short, things look bad for the Crusaders. They are starving, they are ravaged by disease, and it's then that a miracle occurs. This is the account that they give us. And the miracle is that one of their priests has a vision and is told where to find the lance of Longinus. Longinus, which is a great Roman word meaning lance, anyway, is the guy who supposedly pierced Christ's side at the crucifixion. And he's given a vision of where to find this in Antioch. And they go dig, and they find a rusted old piece of metal, and they go, ha-ha, there's a lance of Longinus. Now, interesting corollary to that story, some people don't believe him, and the priest eventually undergoes a trial by ordeal to prove that it's true, and he dies, which is not a good sign, but they still buy it. They're still okay with it. And so now that they clearly have God's favor, they march out onto the field, and they fight this much larger Muslim army that had been besieging them, and against all odds, they win. They defeat the Muslim army out on the fields outside of Antioch, which probably came as a great surprise to the Muslims. But when you read the accounts of the Christians, they talk about how while they were fighting, armies of angels clad in white came out of the mountains and fought alongside them and so forth. They also claim that the ghost of Adamar, the bishop of Puy, who died at Antioch, by the way, during the siege, he came back and he was leading them into battle. I make great hay of this in my book. But the point is that to them, this is clearly the hand of God is, pushing them towards victory. Now, I don't want to sound cynical, but it is entirely possible that that did not happen. I just want you to know that it is possible that armies of angels did not actually descend from the heavens or the mountains and fight alongside the Crusaders, but either way, they won the battle. So either way, geopolitically, they are successful and they take Antioch. But what happens is Bohemond doesn't want to go on. So what's starting to happen is that the crusade is kind of fragmenting. So Bohemond basically says, all right, I'm going to stay here. I'm the one who took the city. I'm going to make myself, Prince of Antioch or something. And all the other crusaders are like, but you said you'd go to Jerusalem. He's like, nah, whatever, who cares? So he stays in Antioch. His nephew is already carving out his little kingdom over here in Tarsus. Baldwin of Flanders is over here marrying an Armenian princess and turning himself into the Count of Edessa. So what's left of the Crusader army marches down and actually takes Jerusalem without too much trouble, mostly because the main Muslim army, kind of like the Battle of Manzikert had done to the Byzantines, the main Muslim army was destroyed. And so all these cities essentially surrender as they march down. They don't want to be sacked. And so they're like, whatever, we surrender. And by July 15th, they get to Jerusalem and they take the city. Once they take the city, they have to figure out, okay, what do we do? Because we started this process to take an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to die, on the way. And if we didn't die, the Byzantines would be here to clean up the mess. Well, now neither of those things have happened. We're alive. We hate the Byzantines, as hell with them. So what do we do? And what they do is they turn to this fella, Godfrey of Boulogne, and they make him kind of their de facto leader. They call him the advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. So his job is going to be, he's going to hold this whole area together, which is all well and good, and then he dies. He dies like 6 months later. So instead, they turn to, ironically, Baldwin of Flanders, who is his brother, and say, hey, we know you kind of abandoned us, but would you come here and be the king of Jerusalem? And so in looking at this map, this is sort of where you get these various little states that kind of emerge, which I don't think was the intention, right? When they went out on the expedition, this is not what they thought the outcome was going to be. But this is the outcome they've got. Bless you. That was in reference to a sneeze. I need to be very clear for my friends on Zoom. I just wanted to make that clear. So there it is. So you've got this kingdom of Jerusalem, and then you have these other sort of what eventually become known as the Crusader states, kind of loosely tied to it in greater or lesser elements, I guess. And this is kind of the result of the First Crusade, but now they're left with a whole different set of issues of what do we do with these places? Like, this was not the intention of the First Crusade to set up Western Christian style little mini states 3,000 miles from France, but they're going to have to try to figure out what to do with it. Adam, yeah.
And all these guys are also the lords of people back.
Right.
in France.
A lot of these guys are also lords already back in France, so a lot of them are going to leave. So on Tuesday for my students, we will go ahead and talk about the results of this as we move into the later development of the crusading movement in the 12th and 13th centuries. For those of you visiting from place, I apologize that I blathered on too long to answer any questions, but you all know where to find me, I think. So if you do have any questions about this, feel free to shoot me an email or swing by my office or something. Otherwise, thank you much. Yeah, it's been fun. Take care.